to the Conservative Party.
I don't think that Rishi Sunak has what it takes to unite his party at all. I think there's going to be rebellions, there's going to be unrest on the back benches, there's going to be people settling scores, stabbing each other in the back. The Game of Thrones will continue.
A shooting at a high school in the US state of Missouri has killed 3 people. Police say the gunman from the attack in St. Louis is among the dead. Thousands of university lecturers, librarians and staff across the UK have voted in favour of industrial action over pay, conditions and pensions. Strike dates haven't yet been decided. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 44 points at 70.14. The pound buys $1.13 and €1.14. LBC weather clear for most of the UK this evening. A few showers in the west with a low of 10 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 1 minute past 8 on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. This is Monday's Cross Question. Let me tell you who's on our panel. John Penrose is Conservative MP for Weston-Super-Mare, chairs the Conservative Policy Forum and is a former UK anti-corruption champion. Andy McDonald on my far right, first time you've ever been described as that, isn't it? Labour MP for Middlesbrough and a former shadow cabinet member under Jeremy Corbyn. Dr Linda Yueh is an economist based at the University of Oxford and her book is called The Great Economists. And Jim Pickard is Chief Political Correspondent for the Financial Times. So we'd like to invite you to give us a call on 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC and your question will come through on my screen here. And do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's crack on with our first question. It's from Malcolm in Bodmin. Hello, Malcolm.
Evening, Iain. Evening, panel. Does the panel agree with me that having been promised 2 terms minimum of Boris Johnson and the Sunny Uplands, and who will now be receiving more austerity, that they will actually desert Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives at the next election?
Are you talking about voters generally or voters like in the Red Wall or what?
The Red Wall seat, sorry, and the Red Wall seat.
OK. Jim Pickard.
Well, look, if you look at the latest opinion polls on this, which were on the Liz Truss, I think there was a 60-point gap between Labour and the Tories. I mean, that is a whole White
56. House. We wouldn't want to exaggerate it, Jim.
No, it was a very tiny 56-point lead for Labour in the Red Wall. Now, of course, Rishi Sunak is a different proposition. I think he will look more managerial, more professional, and he won't spook the markets in the same way that Truss has. But I think once you've lost the support in these places, it's very, very hard to win it back, as Labour has found for the last however many years. And I think when you look at the macro factors that are happening, if you look at the rise of interest rates, the rise in mortgage rates, potential fall in house prices next year and beyond, and you think of the fact that the energy rescue scheme is going to run out after April, I think these problems are too big for one single change in personnel in Downing Street to fix. I think I'd be amazed if the Red Wall is maintained. There'll be some seats which could be held onto. And I think Rishi Sunak versus Keir Starmer is a fairer fight than Liz Truss versus Keir Starmer. But I just think when people's mortgages go up by 50% or whatever it is in the coming months, that's going to be fatal to the Conservative Party in these places.
What are you hearing about who Rishi Sunak will appoint as his Chancellor?
We are working on the basis that it's Jeremy Hunt. I've been out on the terrace in the House of Commons this evening chatting to a lot of MPs. That is what they think. We could still be surprised. And I noticed a slightly sort of sceptical look in your eyes, Ian. What are you hearing?
I think it should be Jeremy Hunt. I think it probably will be Jeremy Hunt, but there's a lot of people are saying, well, it could be Mel Stride, the chair of the Select Committee, who's very, very close to Rishi Sunak, his closest political ally, or even Steve Barclay, who, of course, was Chief Secretary under Rishi at the Treasury when he was Chancellor. So, because there was... Apparently, Jeremy Hunt reached out to all 3 leadership candidates, and only Penny Mordaunt actually talked to him, and Rishi Sunak didn't answer the calls. I don't know if that's a straw in the wind. We'll probably sit here this time tomorrow and somebody will say, Iain, you were tipping Mel Stride to be Chancellor. It's still Jeremy Hunt. What have you got to say for yourself?
I think Stride will be rewarded with a good job.
Yeah.
For his great loyalty. He's been loyal to Sunak quite loudly over the last 6 or 7 weeks, where we've heard nothing from Sunak at all, really, since the beginning of September, have we? I think if you were trying to make that calculation, if you were in Sunak's team, you would probably think changing Chancellor yet again is going to potentially spook the markets. Maybe a bit of stability is required.
John Penrose, you were a Penny Mordaunt supporter. I mean, how are you feeling tonight? Do you think that she was hard done by?
No, not hard done by. It's a democracy, and you have to accept the results that you're handed. So, not hard done by. Slightly sad. I thought that Penny is an incredibly strong candidate, but actually, when we got down to this morning, and it was a sort of frantic rush to see whether or not we could get Penny over the 100 nominations line. The thing which I really felt, and which a lot of other Conservative MPs felt as well, was actually with these two, they're both grown-ups, they're both really good. The party will be well served whichever. So yeah, I mean, I was really reassured as well. The first thing that Rishi Sunak said when he came to address the 1922 committee as the newly anointed leader was, he made a point of calling out admiration and respect for people like Penny, which he didn't have to do. That was his moment, and the first words out of his mouth was that. And then he talked about the need to bring everyone together, because we have got a heck of a fight on our hands, as your caller just said. And I think actually, there are sort of 3 or 4 things that, if we can get them done, and which in a normal parliament, when there hadn't been a pandemic, you'd expect the solutions to already be underway. So things like the soaring cost of housing to rent or to buy, things like the soaring cost of energy, and things like immigrants in small boats coming across the channel. If we can get those 3 things, realistically, solutions underway, then I think we've got everything to play for. But without that, then people are going to say, well, hang on a sec, we still remember 6 weeks after the mini budget when it really wasn't very good.
So going back to Malcolm's question, does the panel agree that Rishi Sunak will lose the red wall? You're essentially saying, well, we could, unless we get those 3 things right, and probably a bit more too. Yeah, I mean, if nothing changes, the poll numbers that you just quoted won't change either. We have got to make sure that we are. We should actually say that it wasn't a 56% lead; it was a 33% lead. But Labour are on 56%. I think you were saying it was like a. I thought
it was a national lead of 35ish, but I thought in the red wall the lead was.
Oh, is it
much bigger?
But I bow to your superior knowledge on that.
But either way, the point is, there are 3 or 4 things that really matter. And if we can show progress on them, we've still got time to do that. But in a normal parliament, we'd have done it. Any government would have done it at the start. But because of the pandemic, that couldn't happen. Then I think that there's all to play for. But we have got to show that we've got a grip on the things that matter to everybody, like the things I just mentioned.
Linda, we all remember James Carville saying it's the economy, stupid. But I mean, now it really is, isn't it? Because I think it's going to be very difficult for Rishi Sunak at the next election to stare down the barrel of a camera and say, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Because most people, frankly, won't be. So what do you agree with John on what the key things are to maintain the red wall seats?
Yes, I think it comes down to cost of living at this point. I think recession isn't going to make things easier, but if you can get the cost of living measures targeted to those who need it most, it's possible to cushion the extent of the recession. In other words, you can actually make the recession both shorter and less severe, which of course would prevent a rise in unemployment. So those 2 things are actually linked. So if it is, I think at the moment, economy. We are currently probably in recession, and we will be in recession for about 15 months, according to the Bank of England. Any party that is in charge now will be saddled with that. So the question is what you can say, well, everyone around the world is heading into recession, sure, but the UK cannot be, as it were, the worst. You have to show you have used your policies to help people, to cushion it, and to be able to show we've made a difference. I think one of the most damaging things from the last few weeks is we were always headed for an era of higher interest rates because of inflation. We were always headed for recession. It's just that everything came really quickly. And that really caused people to point the finger and say, actually, it is the government. They will eventually have pointed that finger. I think it just came much sooner. And I don't know if this will help or not, but if the 15-month projection is about right, then that means that the economy will start to recover towards the end of next year, end of 2023. And when is the next general election?
Sometime, well, it could be January 2025, but I can't really imagine they're going to want to have an election in January.
Everyone's assuming sometime in 2025.
I think autumn 2024.
So could be recovering by then. So I think that's when he can point to
it's
say,
a long
I've done
time
these
away,
things.
isn't it, Andy McDonald?
It is.
I mean, you basically represent a red wall seat, so you're probably better equipped to answer this question than anybody else.
Well, I think in what you were saying about the stats on it, people are just so utterly fed up. I mean, people are feeling this really badly. And the difficulty with the Conservative Party is that they cannot keep on... it's like Doctor Who, they keep walking through the door and there's this new government. I'm afraid no, it's a Conservative Party in government.
When I saw David Tennant was coming back as Doctor Who, I thought, well, that's an indication that Boris Johnson will be coming back as Prime Minister.
Well, I was thinking more of the checkouts at, Prime Minister number 5, please. A bit like that. But I think people have just so had it, and it's the last week, not just last week, but the last month or so, and then that mini budget is still ringing in people's ears because it came on a focus on rewarding the wealthiest in society, giving them a massive pay, and that's really gone down so badly with people. Those were your priorities, to help the richest in our society and let bankers have unlimited bonuses. So they've got the message, and that sets the tone, and trying to recover from that is hugely difficult. And what Rishi Sunak has said today is that austerity 2.0 is coming straight at you. And people are saying...
To be fair, he didn't say that, but...
Well, difficult decision to...
Well, you might have interpreted him saying that, but he didn't say that.
I think that's a fair summation, Ian, that austerity 2.0 is coming straight at you. And after 12 years of this, people are just going to say, oh, no, not again. My wages have gone back over. I can't pay my bills. And because of the catastrophic errors that your party made in government, I'm now facing another £500 on my mortgage, or parents are looking after the children and say, have you got a fixed rate? Because that was the first question I asked my kids. Have you got your mortgage fixed for a couple of years? Look, desperate to see that happen. But you've also got benefits are just lagging behind. You've got in-work poverty and endemic poverty in these situations. And people understand it. Even those who are able to weather the storm more broadly, better than people in that position, they feel it. They really feel very angry about it. So I agree. I can't think that those sorts of levels of polling leads will be sustained. They're inevitably going to reduce somewhat, but I sense that there's a core within that will not be eroded that easily, and I think that's where we're looking at the moment.
But it doesn't mean that people are rushing back to Labour, does it?
No, this is a real visceral reaction to this financial insult that they've had, and they've said, this, and we'll see, won't we, in May next year when we get the local elections, and I think that will be the first test. And I strongly suspect that the Conservative Party are not looking forward to those round of elections.
I think that's
very much.
That's the best prediction you've made so far. John Penrose, do you take the analogies between what's going on now and what happened in 1992 after Black Wednesday, where, effectively it took the Conservatives 18 years to recover their reputation for economic competence, didn't it? And even though the economy was going great guns by the time of the election in 1997, the Conservatives got no credit for it whatsoever because people remembered what happened in September 1992.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of differences.
You hope there are.
Well, I certainly hope there are, yeah. But I genuinely think there are. Some of them are political, some of them are economic. So the political one is we aren't up against Tony Blair, and that matters. I'm not decrying Keir Starmer at all, but he's a very different kettle of fish. And also, while the announcements were very worrying for those of us who care about making sure that the benefits of economic growth are fairly shared right the way across society, including to those who've got least, of which is actually the majority of the Conservative Party, the announcement was not that when the mini-budget was put up. And so it took us 3 weeks to make sure that, for example, the top rate of tax wasn't got rid of, as announced. And that means that while the announcement wasn't great, actually the reality is a great deal better than the announcement. Now, that means that we've got something to build off. There's actually a foundation of reality which is different.
Do you not think, though, this has really gone into people's heads? This is not something that people will forget about in 6 weeks, even 6 months' time. People will remember this for a long time.
I think people will remember it, but I think also that if we can show that we are, that we've avoided the problem with the 1992 example you were coming up with is that that was an event that happened and affected everybody. And what this was an announcement that got rolled back before most of it could happen.
Well, no, that's not true at all. The financial markets plummeted, therefore interest rates have gone up far. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Linda, but if that mini budget hadn't happened, mortgage rates would not be doing what they are now.
It wouldn't have gone up this quickly, and probably the big difference is how the speed, I think, that it increased, which is why people can't disentangle the two things.
I wasn't trying to make that point. I was trying to make the point about the top rate of tax, which was due to change and didn't.
Yeah.
So we've dodged that bullet. Now, I'm not trying to say that all is perfect. It absolutely isn't. And I think that therefore we will have to make sure again that if we can fix those fundamental underlying points I was making about housing and about energy, we're going to have to fix those. Otherwise, we're still going to be in difficulty.
You may have remedied the 45p measure, but I think the point is that when people's mortgages now go up, they're going to associate it with the Liz Truss mini budget, the Conservative mini budget. Not entirely 100% fairly because interest rates were already rising, but it's the exact correlation of what
the government of the day owns it.
14 years ago, the Labour government owned the financial crash, which wasn't entirely their fault, and you guys were very ruthless at pinning it on them, and they're going to do the same to you.
Andy?
Well, I just think it exposed the intention of the party, that this could possibly happen in these circumstances where people were already feeling the pain, that this was the way that the response of the government of the day was to help the richest most. And not only that, they abandoned any sense of checking this out, making sure that the markets were prepared for this. It was done recklessly, and that sticks with people, that you would take such a terrible gamble. And I'm afraid the charge around the whole trickle-down economics and all of the think tanks, the IEA and all the rest of it, and now are sticking at that level. But it's how people feel about it. So that was just so bad for us.
Malcolm, thank you very much for your question. We'll move on in just a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask a question to our panel. It's 18 minutes past 8.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Have your say on the new PM. Only on LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
If you've just tuned in, on our panel we have John Penrose, Conservative MP for Weston-Super-Mare, Andy McDonald, Labour MP for Middlesbrough, Dr Linda Yueh from Oxford University, and Jim Pickard from the Financial Times. Let's go to our next question. It's a text question from William in Hull. How can we be called a true democracy and go on about democratic values when Sunak becomes PM only by the backing of Conservative MPs? Does the panel think British democracy is in decline? Andy McDonald.
Yeah, I do. I agree with the question. I think that democracy is in decline when you have a situation like this where it hasn't even gone to the Tory party membership.
Well, in 2007, Gordon Brown became Prime Minister without even going to Labour MPs.
Yeah, no, fair point. Fair point. Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. But we're talking about here and now.
It makes a long-term trend.
Yeah, but I think we've got a real problem with this. I mean, my own view, I've changed over the years. I'm in favour of proportional representation because I do think people don't have.
How would that affect situations like this?
Well, no, we're talking about a different thing. But I think the loss of democratic accountability in that relationship, I think, is worrying. We know from when we knock on doors, when people just say, "I'm just not going to vote." I mean, when people say that to you, I mean, we should worry about that. And we look at some of our by-elections and our council elections, and you can get into single figures in some wards. I mean, that is a pretty rum do when we get to that level. So on this one, I think there is a problem because obviously Boris Johnson could say he had a mandate in 2019. But things have changed so dramatically. We've now got a situation where somebody gets in, doesn't even go to the members. And the point being, of course, Ian, the danger was perhaps the membership wouldn't have voted for Rishi Sunak.
Well, we'll never know that, will we? I suspect if he had a massive parliamentary majority over Penny Mordaunt, they probably would have. But I mean, we will never know. Jim?
I think that you have a point about the democratic deficit between Rishi Sunak compared to Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson, of course, went to a general election and achieved that big landslide. I think it's more complicated than Andy suggests, though, that the idea that the membership is more democratic than the MPs, because in a way the MPs have to listen to constituents in their seat. They hear the views of Labour supporters, Conservative supporters. They may have a more kind of a broader view of what the country as a whole thinks than the membership. As we saw with Liz Truss, the membership thought it would be great to have tens of billions of pounds of unfunded tax cuts, and look how that ended. And I think there's a comparison with what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, where he was beloved by the Labour membership, but the inverted commas moderate, or you would call them right-wing Labour MPs, would always say, well, hang on a sec, just because he gets the membership excited, that should not be as relevant as what do our constituents, what does general voters think?
Linda?
I thought it was really telling in Liz Truss's resignation speech, and I did listen to the whole thing. It was 89 seconds, right? She said, "I cannot deliver the mandate that I have from the Conservative Party," and that is actually somewhat. It was deliberate phrasing, because if Boris had won the general election with a mandate from the electorate to support his position. So if you're going to change prime ministers, then I think sticking to the manifesto would be a sounder position in terms of this is what the voters had voted for. In a parliamentary system, if you decide to change prime ministers, you've changed prime ministers, but to change policies wholesale, I think that's a leap, and I think that's why Liz was so careful in saying I had a mandate from the party. I suppose some in the party would disagree that she had that mandate.
I mean, John, obviously we're in unprecedented times, but there were 3 prime ministers, I think, in the early 1830s. So it has happened before, but admittedly a long time ago. But you can understand why people think there should be a general election, can't you?
Well, I understand why the Labour Party are calling for it, because it's the first time they've had a poll lead for about 15 years. So of course they're calling for a general election. But I think the point that your question is driving at about the democratic legitimacy is really important. And while constitutionally, clearly, we're not a presidency, we're a we're a parliamentary democracy.
Thinks we are.
Yeah, well, Jacob is a valued parliamentary colleague, but I would respectfully disagree with him on that one. The point
when you say valued parliamentary colleague, do we need to have a translating machine? I mean, I'm happy to provide one.
He's my next door neighbour in Somerset.
Oh, no, okay, let's not go there.
But the point is that in a parliamentary democracy, yes, of course, by definition, a parliamentary democracy, the Prime Minister is the person who can command a majority in the House of Commons. But I think that the point about legitimacy, though, goes much, much deeper than that, much more fundamental. And it's to do with democratic trust by voters in the people they elect. And that applies to opposition MPs, it applies to government MPs, certainly applies to ministers and shadow ministers. And I think what we've seen over the last 20, 25 years is actually it was after the Iraq War, there was a sort of step down in the level of participation, the level of voter turnout in general elections. And that's partly to do with with things like sleaze, it's partly to do with dodgy dossiers and all those other bits and pieces. And I just think that there's a series of integrity measures which we could and we should introduce, and I'm certainly going to be hoping that Rishi will do some of them, which will help.
Okay.
In order just to rebuild or start to rebuild. It's a slow process. Rebuild some of that trust.
Let's try and fit in another question before we go to the news. Iain in Cardiff, what would you like to ask? Hi.
Hi, Iain. Hi, panel. Hi, Jim. Rishi Sunak is a rich man. Indeed, he's reckoned to be the richest Prime Minister in history. To what extent do the panel believe that that can be used against him by opposition parties?
Well, let's find out. Andy McDonald again.
Well, I do think it's going to be very...
Short answers on this, please.
Very difficult for somebody in his position to understand the hardships that people are facing. And I'm not exaggerating when I express my fears that people in constituencies like mine will be dying in their own homes this winter. We've got some benign weather right now. That will turn. I fail to understand how he can begin to comprehend some of the challenges that people are going to be facing in the coming months.
Linda?
I think he'll have to show through his policy actions if that he can. I think he would argue, I think he said if you think back to the summer in the leadership campaign, he said that he does understand, in which case he needs to show it with the policies to show the voters that he is supporting the most vulnerable, the least well off, and helping support them. And it's only going to be by actions, not words. That's going to matter.
John?
I think that's right. We have in the past had some pretty posh prime ministers, but people have liked them and indeed, loved them because they felt that if they walked into a pub, they wouldn't mind having a beer with them, and that's everybody from Tony Blair through to David Cameron. So I think the acid test is actually does this person understand me? Does this person understand my life? Whether or not they are rich or poor, do they understand what's going on? And if they do, then that's what really matters, I think.
Jim?
Yeah, and I think Rishi Sunak's wealth is stratospheric. It's far beyond anything we've seen in any British politician. Certainly in my lifetime, it's in the hundreds of millions of pounds of him and his wife, who's, of course, the daughter of a billionaire. And him turning up in expensive shoes and Teesside and that kind of thing is politically a little bit tricky. But I think there are also pitfalls for the Labour Party if they start going on and on about how this guy is a former hedge fund manager and an entrepreneur and he's ever so rich.
Green card holder.
Because a lot of people in this country, even people who are struggling to pay the bills, still have aspiration. They still want to get on and see themselves and their children make something of their lives and become successful entrepreneurs.
Well, hang on. The people who do all those jobs that we talked about through the pandemic, weren't those people making something of their lives, making a contribution? This is the thing, you've got to be aspirational, move on to get to a better job. What about the jobs that have to be done day in, day out? Why can't we treat those with dignity and with respect? And this is what annoys me about this conversation about if you're doing badly, go and get a better job. Go, move.
I would love a world where care home workers got paid more than hedge fund managers. I agree with you on that. I'm just saying for the Labour Party there is a political trap there if you sound too down on aspiration.
Because I think part of the problem here is that he wasn't born into wealth, was he? No. I mean, he actually did create wealth himself and then married, obviously, a very rich woman, the daughter of an Indian billionaire.
I'm quite happy not to pay their taxes in this country. Chancellor of the Exchequer to Prime Minister, somebody who would actually have arrangements whereby their first loyalty was to another country. I think that's going to be a major problem for him because people will keep mentioning it ad infinitum. I will.
The London issue is a little bit tricky.
You're actually making... I wrote a piece on whenever it was, it seems a long time ago now, but I think it was only Friday, where I wrote a piece explaining why I thought Penny Mordaunt should win. And part of it was, I said Labour MPs will throw everything which you've just thrown at Rishi Sunak. I mean, understandably. I mean, it's getting down and dirty in a political war, isn't it?
Absolutely, but those are the realities. And it was only when that was exposed that he said, "Oh, I must get rid of the green card." Now that people know about it, and it was only when we knew that his wife was not paying her taxes in this country that she made different arrangements so that she did pay her taxes. So that it has a nasty flavour about it. Put it that way.
Okay.
People don't feel comfortable about it.
Right. We will come back to your questions in just a moment. It's 8:32 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
Rishi Sunak has conceded the UK faces a profound economic challenge ahead of becoming Prime Minister tomorrow. The former Chancellor and current PM Liz Truss will see the King tomorrow to formally transfer power. NATO's Secretary-General says allies reject allegations from Russia that Ukraine's preparing to use a so-called dirty bomb on its own territory. Jens Stoltenberg says Moscow must not use it as a pretext for escalation. And Aston Villa have appointed former Arsenal boss Unai Emery as their new boss. He's leaving Villarreal but won't take over until the 1st of November. LBC weather clear for most of the UK this evening. A few showers in the west with a low of 10 degrees.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Have your say on the new PM. Only on LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36 is the time on LBC. It's Cross Question with John Penrose, Conservative MP, anti-McDonald Labour MP. Dr. Linda Yueh, who's an economist, has written a book called The Great Economist. I guess it does what it says on the tin. Who's the greatest economist of all time?
Oh, that's very hard, but probably Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations is still the seminal text.
I visited his ancestral homestead in Edinburgh, which has been completely renovated. I don't know if it's well worth a visit, actually. Okay. It's really got a sort of aura about it. And Jim Pickard is Chief Political Correspondent for the Financial Times. Right, let's go to another question. It's from Eli, who's in Edmonton. Eli, hello. What would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask the panel how Rishi Sunak is going to address the strike action that's going on in the country at the moment.
Well, and possible future strike action, because, of course, ambulance people, they are balloting on strike action, and lots of other sectors as well. We always talk about winters of discontent, summers of discontent, but it does seem as though there could well be that kind of atmosphere over the course of the next few months. Jim Pickard, how do you think Rishi Sunak is going to deal with that?
I have no idea where exactly he's going to land on this, but you can see a potential landing spot, which is that an offer is agreed between the unions and the government, which is somewhere between the previous summer offer of about 5.5% for most workers and inflation, which is about 10%. You could see an offer about 8%, which the unions, I think, might accept. But of course, the flip side of that is that it costs money, and we are seeing the Chancellor doing this fiscal statement on Halloween in a few days' time, where he's going to be actually cutting public expenditure and raising some taxes, and therefore finding the money to pay workers as much as it would politically get them out of a hole is going to be quite expensive and quite tricky.
Linda?
I agree with that. I think it needs to be done fairly, and I think it's going to be financially he's going to argue it's going to be financially quite challenging. My guess is, and this is purely a guess, is that on October 31st, he will backload any austerity measures and focus on, helping people with the cost of living crisis now and balance the books over, say, a 5-year instead of a 3-year horizon. And if you think about this as being an energy supply shock with residuals of the pandemic lockdown feeding it all in, it is globally, everybody is in the same position. It's a massive shock. It's like the 1970s. So it would warrant, I think, a longer extended period. But if you raise public spending, then you ultimately have to either cut public spending or raise taxes or grow the economy. And we all know how hard that is, even over a 5-year period. So I don't expect the growth forecast to do enough to allow him to avoid having to raise taxes or cut spending.
Where do you see inflation going over the next year? Because it's 10.1% now. Yeah. If, say, by May, June next year, it's come down quite significantly, do you think that's an argument that can be used by employers, whether public sector or private sector, to say, well, OK, we realise it's 10.1% now, but all the forecasts show that it's going to come down?
So I think employers will be worried that inflation is likely to come down next year if, and by the way, you mentioned my book, The Great Economist. There's a great economist saying economic forecasting exists to make astrology look respectable. So, because inflation is a year-on-year measure, so long as it's not increasing at the pace of 10.1%, which it currently is, say next year it's increasing at, say, 6% or whatever it is. And here's the tricky part. Prices are still high, they're just not increasing as quickly, then I think employers would say that this is what we fix it to this year. But next year, if we do the same rationale, it's going to be lower. What employers I think would worry about is that you end up with very high inflation. People get used to this is the price rise, and then they want it the following year. But I think most people appreciate that this is, they will look at what's happening with inflation, how much money they have in their pocket. And I think that is a judgment that people, I think, would make. But this is hugely uncertain. And I think if inflation were to come down, it would also, government could contribute to that by reducing the amount that the energy prices we pay coming out of our pocket, because that directly measures, it goes into the measure of inflation. So I think there are things that fiscal policy can do, and I would hope the government does a lot of that on Halloween. Not the best day, I must say.
No, I wonder whoever thought that was a good idea, John Penrose.
I just want to ask, Linda, a question about that, because Linda, you said that if you were the Chancellor, you'd half expect him to say he's going to balance the books over 5 years rather than 3. And I just wonder how you think the financial markets are going to react to that, because if he can do that, it's a really helpful thing for him to do. But it does require him to be able to look the financial markets in the eye and say, trust me over 5 years rather than trust me over 3. That's often quite difficult. How do you reckon it'll work in the current environment? You're the top economist. What do you reckon?
It's completely not unreasonable to explain to financial markets that in a downturn, so say between now, we said the recession is likely to go on, unfortunately, till the end of next year. So that already takes you to 2024. So what you're asking for is 2024 to 2027 as the basis to stabilize debt levels. So what you shouldn't do is to impose austerity and cut spending during a recession. And so I think almost by definition, you would expect the books to be, this is to stabilize the debt level over the longer term.
So you reckon he can do that, and that will actually be acceptable?
Yeah, I think that's I keep saying Sunak is a chancellor, but of course he was the chancellor. He was actually very effective at communicating this. And I think what we've learned, I think what we've all learned in the past few weeks is financial markets price things in. So you have to be able to communicate with them how you're doing it, the realistic assumptions, allow them to differ with you, but everything that is priced in is just less shocking. So things have to be priced in. It does require good comms.
And I think some of the specific things they're looking at is the freezing income tax thresholds. They will maintain that for a few years longer, so you have fiscal drag raising some money there. And I think also the cut in aid that was announced a year or two ago, that was meant to end in a few years' time. I think they're going to continue that, as you say, for a couple of years.
Let's just remind us of Eli's question. How should Sunak deal with the wave of strikes taking place across various sectors and across the nation? Andy McDonald.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of points on this, because there is legislation coming right now that's going to repeal all the European legislation, and we don't know where that hits in terms of the employment rights and protections, what's going to be left after that, and I think people are quite confused about what's going to replace it. So that's one point.
Most of our employment rights are superior to European minimum standards, aren't they?
Yeah, but the point being that everything that was in European law is effectively got a sunset clause, and and it's going to go. We don't know what's going to replace it, and that's the worry. And of course, some of the noises have been about a reduction in standards and rights. So that is worrying. There's also, in direct response to Eli's question, there's a minimum service level agreement bill coming next week for transport, which is it's the major area of dispute. So what you can do, you can decide to, let's inflame the situation and go to war. That's one of the options by pursuing these sorts of things. Or you can start to take some more rational measures, and Linda's referred to it. There's the offer there from Shell and BP, tax us. We can do this. If you hit us with a windfall tax that can ameliorate the impact of this energy shock, that will impact upon people's the cost of living crisis that people are enduring. So he has those choices available to him. But of course, the other point Linda made about a 5-year long-term plan for how you would backfill some of these things as you described it. Of course, he hasn't got 5 years. He's up against it. He's got a very, very short space of time, and an election will take place before then. So those pressures are going to be absolutely enormous on him.
There obviously already is in the windfall tax on energy. Do you mean a bigger one?
Yeah, a bigger one. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's available. And the oil and gas companies will not reduce their level of investment in renewables or whatever they're doing. That they have said that. So we've got to take them at their word and say that they can accept higher levels of tax in this crisis because it's so unusual, and it's the right response.
I get very pedantic about this one because Conservative ministers keep pretending there is no windfall tax, and Labour keeps pretending that the Conservative government hasn't done a windfall tax. It's raising £28 billion
we all voted for it.
And you're extending it to electricity producers. But yes.
Right, we'll move on to more questions in just a moment. It's 8:45 on LBC.
LBC.
apply.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. John Penrose, Andy McDonald, Linda Yueh and Jim Pickard with us taking your calls. Let's go to Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Iain and panel. Yeah, should Liz Truss be given £115,000 a year for life after just 48 days as PM?
We should make clear this money is to run a private office. It doesn't go into her bank account. Well, I suppose it does go into an office bank account, but you know what I mean. It's not for her personal use. Linda?
Only if she has ex-prime ministerial things to pay for. I think she should think very carefully about whether or not what she's doing is actually related to having been prime minister, and then she can claim it and be scrutinised on it.
Because this was brought in, I think, when Margaret Thatcher left office, because obviously she'd been such a world figure that, and I think in the first few days after she left office, there were like literally 20,000 letters to answer. Well, there's no office, no way of paying for that. So I think that's how it started. But she'd been Prime Minister for 11 and a half years, John. I don't think Liz Truss made 11 and a half weeks.
But the volume of, well, nowadays it's emails, of course, isn't it? Will be stupendous, I'm sure. So the point about, and I think the same thing goes, I'm not sure, it may go for former leaders of the opposition as well, but I'm not quite certain. But certainly, if you've been someone at that, it doesn't. No. But if you've been someone at in that public position, then you do just get an awful lot of stuff that if you're being polite and reasonable, you should be replying to. Now, if she doesn't, then she may decide that she doesn't need that many staff. But that's the reason.
Andy McDonald, £115,000 sounds an awful lot of money, but actually it's enough to rent an office and have 2 members of staff, isn't it?
Yeah. That's right, but John's point, she's going to get an awful lot of emails and all the rest of it. I don't think anybody's going to be bothering Liz Truss again. I think she's gone and forgotten quite quickly. I don't think she's going to be troubled.
We'll wait and see.
Jim?
I don't think the duties of the Liz Truss fan club are going to be very onerous. Don't take them out.
So cruel. Well, Martin, you got your answer there. What do you think?
No, I don't think she should get it. I mean, everything that's like all us, like we dealing with cost of living. £115,000. It's a lot of money. You know what I mean? And we're struggling to pay his bills and everything. And it's like all these MPs over the last few months who have had ministerial jobs, and they get payoffs, and ministers, that have come and gone over the last few months. It's just a joke now. You know what I mean? Taxpayers' money.
I think you're right. The rules do need to be amended. I think Michelle Donlan was entitled to claim £17,000 after she spent one day as Education Secretary, but to her credit, she said she wouldn't. Right, a tweet question from Pat. He says, who do the panel think Tory MP Sir Charles Walker was referring to when he talked about talentless people in government? Who should Rishi Sunak be clearing out of office as soon as he can, John Penrose?
Oh, God. I don't know who Charles meant. I haven't had a chance to ask him. I'd actually, now you've reminded me, I think I am going to go and ask him after this and see who he had in mind. But the point, I think, is that, as we were saying earlier on, I think that Rishi Sunak's in a very strong position to have as much of a clean sweep of his ministerial ranks as he wants to. And I think that what he's going to have to do is to change quite a lot of people out, because he's going to have to create a cross-party, broad base coalition. And he said that, and Penny Mordaunt was saying that if she'd won, she'd have done the same. So that's going to be necessary. And inevitably, given the challenges which we've all been talking about up until now, you're going to want to have your most talented team. So I'm afraid I'm dodging the question on names.
You are dodging the question.
Because I don't know who Charles meant.
If you ask me, I could write down probably a dozen or maybe even 20 names off the top of my head.
Yeah, but would you say them on air?
No.
Yeah,
because I might have to interview you in the future. So exactly. I sympathise with you.
I'm about to go back and have a drink with most of them.
I think, let's put it this way, the Education Department might deserve, apart from the Secretary of State, I think that might deserve a bit of a clear out. But that's as far as I'm going to go. Who hasn't answered this? I can't remember.
Everybody else.
I'm not going to start labelling any MPs as
because you need them as contacts too, don't you?
Because we're a very objective news organisation, the FT. What I will say is that, having talked to some of the senior people in the Sunak team earlier today, I think they saw the fact that Liz Truss promoted her friends and allies and people who were neighbouring constituents in Norfolk to cabinet positions was not a great look. And I think Sunak is going to reach out to people who supported Johnson, and he's going to reach out across the party and find talent, which was something that Truss conspicuously failed to do. And I think that's probably better for the country, isn't it?
Yeah, Linda.
Yeah, ditto. I think Sunak has to unite the party, and the only way to do that would be to reach across and find the most talented people. I think he is quite a technocrat at heart, and so hopefully politically he is able to do that.
Do you know, Andy McDonald, I don't know if you agree with me, one of the key appointments that he's got to make is as chief whip, because it's not Rishi Sunak who chooses all the junior ministers, it's generally the whips do, and you get the wrong whip and you might be in a bit of trouble, and as Liz Truss found out.
Well, absolutely, and it's such a difficult job to do. I would hate to be chief whip because there's such a lot.
Jackie Smith said she loved it.
Did she?
She got to tell Diane Abbott to F off.
Oh. Oh dear! I'm sure perhaps Diane had a retort, but there's an awful lot of hard-nosed stuff goes on in with the chief whip. There's also other stuff that goes on as well. And there's a pastoral role that has to be discharged as well. It's quite I wouldn't want to do the damn job, to be perfect.
Any one minister that you would literally rejoice at if they got the sack?
I can't name any because it's like a revolving door. I don't know who was a minister any day of the week. The one that answered the question was Suella Braverman. Her response, bragging about having joy and rejoicing at a plane leaving,
dreaming about it.
Her dream was what a strange thing to dream about. Ambitions about people in desperate straits having to be deported out of this country to somewhere they had no notion of. What a horrible thing to say, and I think that really did jar with so many people, and I think jarred with a lot of people in the Conservative Party too.
Right, here's a question from Simon. Is the political end of Boris Johnson a positive for the country? Linda.
Is it the end of Boris Johnson?
I'm giving you all the political ones first, aren't I?
But is it the end of Boris Johnson?
Well,
I guess that would be the question I would
pose.
pose.
Watch this space, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult to conceive of circumstances now that he could come back, I would have thought, but maybe I'm not being imaginative enough.
I think this is probably trained for everybody else. But can I just give the Sunak quote about why I think he's a technocrat? Because he always quotes his father-in-law, the billionaire founder of Infosys. He says, his father-in-law always says, in God we trust, everybody else has to bring data to the table.
Yes.
Well, on this question, we can't bring data to the table. But, Jim, do you think we've seen the end of Boris Johnson? And if we have, is that a positive for the country?
I think as a politically, I need to say impotent, objective commentator, that one's not for me to answer. I don't see him coming back now because I think Sunak will make it to the next general election. And I can't see Boris Johnson, who has been Mayor of London for 8 years, who's been Prime Minister for 3 years, who can make a fortune in the private sector just by standing up and doing a funny speech or writing a book or a column. Being the leader of the opposition is a gruelling, depressing task. You guys know this better than I do. Being in opposition is miserable. Boris Johnson is not a politician for a miserable job and miserable time. So I think this could actually...
What he would want is somebody to take on the job of leader of the opposition, and then he comes in 6 months before an election to grab the glory. You can see that happening, can't you?
That's more feasible.
Andy McDonald.
I think it's over. I think he's had his fun. We've had all the comedy and the pantomimes with him, and he's had a hell of a good run as mayor, and then coming back into Parliament. You can't keep doing that Houdini act, and I think he's going to be better rewarded elsewhere, being entertaining on the circuit, and that's going to do him very, very well. He won't be back. I think that's
John.
I wouldn't be so sure. Politics changes so flipping fast. I don't think any of us would have predicted today 2 months ago. So I wouldn't be too sure. And he is incredibly talented and incredibly resilient. However, I do think he's got some very important hurdles that he's got to jump over first, notably the Privileges Committee investigation into whether or not he misled Parliament. So there's an awful lot of things that might go wrong and might put him out forever. But with someone like Boris, never say never.
And on that bombshell, let's go to our final text question from Timothy in Pinner. Doctor Who fans are, of course, thrilled to see David Tennant back as the Doctor after 12 years. Which political hero would you like to regenerate and make a triumphant return? Jim?
So I think because it's a Conservative government, I'm going to choose a Conservative. And I think from my perspective as a sort of former Remainer, I mean, obviously no one's a Remainer or Brexiteer. We've all moved on from that. But I think there were some very talented people like Michael Heseltine and Rory Stewart who were basically cast into the wilderness by the Conservative leadership a couple of years ago. And, of course, Heseltine is at the end of his career. Rory Stewart still, I think, is in his 40s or early 50s. That's someone who could bring a wealth of political talent to this country. I think it's a shame that he's on the benches.
Andy?
Well, as the question wasn't restricted to this country, I can look elsewhere. And if I could have Nelson Mandela regenerated, because I think the world needs somebody of that stature. We don't have it. Look at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and across the globe in terms of the climate crisis. There's nobody of that stature who can give a world lead, I'm afraid, not even Joe Biden. So Nelson Mandela.
Not even Zelensky.
He's specific on that issue.
You see, I think he's getting to that level, isn't he? That nobody's got a bad word to say about him.
No, you wouldn't in these circumstances have a bad word about him.
Linda?
Well, if we're not restricted in terms of history either, country history, I'd give a third term to Sir Robert Peel, because he lost his premiership, and his party was cast out of the wilderness for repealing the Corn Laws and bringing in the kind of open Britain that we have today. So I'd give him a third shot.
That's
very good.
That's a great answer.
See, that's why we have you on the programme.
Proper microeconomic
give a
reform.
real sense of gravitas to our proceedings.
Proper supply side reform. That was good for you.
John Penrose.
But I'm going to go foreign as well, because given what's going on in Russia at the moment, I think we should bring back Michael Gorbachev instead of the current incumbent. I think what he did to transform the Soviet system and to usher in perestroika and the beginnings of peace, which sadly now reversed.
He's reviled in his own country.
Yeah, but what a statesman and what an amazing leader.
John Penrose, Andy McDonald, Linda Yueh and Jim Pickard, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Cross Question. We're going to continue the discussion on our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in just a moment, and ask the question, how significant is it that he is Britain's first non-white Prime Minister? I'm told on social media that I shouldn't even be talking about this subject, that it's racist to do so. I rather disagree. We'll see what you think in just a moment. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Rishi Sunak will officially succeed Liz Truss as Prime Minister tomorrow. It's been confirmed that they'll both go to Buckingham Palace to see the King, who will then invite Mr Sunak to form a government after Ms Truss formally resigns. Both the outgoing and incoming